Hi, this is Ann Bittinger. I'm the owner of the Bittinger Law Firm. Thank you for joining us on our Uh-Oh series podcast about all things that have to do with healthcare law. Our subject for today is real estate within healthcare, particularly what doctors need to know about real estate. I have with me Alexandra Rudzinski, who is an expert in real estate, all things real estate, right? Leasing, buying, and has specific experience in healthcare. She's the director of healthcare and wellness for Murphy Land and Retail Services. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Ann, for having me.
It's great to have you. Why don't we start with just some background generally? What do you do when a physician comes to you and says, we're thinking of expanding, or we're thinking of adding a new location, or we need to leave this spot because our patients are leaving and moving out to the suburbs?
I think what's very helpful for me is to understand their practice and what their goals are, and if they can help me with understanding their patient base and the type of patient that they want to attract.
So you actually start by learning about what they do at their practice.
Correct. I want to help them. I feel that my job is to be a consultant for them, to optimize the location that they choose and optimize the cost for their practice to make it accessible and convenient for their patient base, for their staff, who are a critical portion of their practice, and also for their referral base. I think, of course, you'll hear this in every area of real estate, the big factor that we look at is location, location, location. What's the optimal location for you? And then we talk about whether the practice would like to lease versus buy.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That's really a financial decision. Some doctors do like to buy their real estate. They feel that they're going to be in a location for a long term. They like to actually own an asset, and they'll put it usually into a separate LLC or LLP.
Right.
And then they can charge, they find it as a way as a moneymaker that they can charge the practice rent and then give it back to themselves.
Absolutely. Write it off as a business expense from the practice.
But with that, there's always pluses and minuses to everything, pros and cons. So with buying real estate, you indeed then become a property owner and have to be responsible for the maintenance. And if you buy a building that is larger than your needs are and you have other tenants, then you become a property manager. And that can often be distracting from what you are doing as a medical practice. And certainly the doctor is not going to be doing any of the property management or upkeep or maintenance.
Absolutely not. So let's hope.
Yes, let's hope. So, or finding tenants. So when you're buying a building, you have to be aware of those types of obligations. And also too, that buildings must be maintained and that new buildings are always being built, particularly now at this time, and that the building that you bought 5 years ago is not going to be as competitive as new buildings coming out of the ground. And so if you do want to sell it, you may think it's worth a lot, but it's not.
Absolutely.
Because it's, it depreciates and it experiences obsolescence. Leasing is often a decision that tenants like, because it gives them the flexibility of a limited window of liability and obligation. And it also gives them the flexibility both to expand or contract or to leave and also to sublease. So it gives them a lot of flexibility. It's more expensive. And that's the trade-off there, the flexibility versus the cost. So, I help doctors and physician practices both lease and buy. There are many options, obviously, within the lease, versus buy decision. You can locate in a medical office building near a hospital or attached to a hospital. The benefits to this are, co-location, and adjacency to the hospital. It can generate referrals to you. You're right near your patients if anybody's admitted and you have to do rounds.
Yep.
We do see a lot of medical office buildings that are standalones in office parks, and they can have single tenants in them or multi-tenants. These are typically close to where the patient base is, where either they work or they live, where their staff is. in many cases, these medical office buildings, the ideal is to have them be a medical destination.
Absolutely.
So they may include multiple services there, not just one practice or one specialty. And again, the downside may be you may not get as many referrals. So again, it's a decision that I think each practice has to make, and that's something we help to flush out.
Absolutely.
What we are seeing now is what I would call the retailization of medical offices and services. And this is where doctors are leaving these sort of medical office buildings and hospitals or standalone medical office buildings and coming to retail locations that are accessible to their patients, accessible to their staff. They take advantage of traffic generated by surrounding tenants, which they can benefit from, and they, in many cases, are convenient and closer to patients' work or home locations, and also to staff's work or home locations.
No big parking garages like when you go to the hospital campus.
That's exactly right. You just have a big parking
lot.
But again, that's actually one complaint I've heard again and again about medical office buildings is, my patient had to wait, circle 10 minutes within a garage. Again, by going into a retail location, you tend to have higher parking counts than you would in a traditional garages, and garages are expensive to build. Land is much cheaper. So again, a retail location will be more convenient for your patient and your staff, and often, depending on where you are within the Jacksonville area, a retail location may be near mass transit. So that gives you an alternate to just having car traffic come to you.
And people know where it is, right?
People know where it is. Yeah.
In Florida particularly, where we have a high Medicare population, we have older drivers trying to find their doctor, right? So things like signage, right?
Signage is often better in a retail space, because that's the whole point. Retail is trying to attract people to a location. Signage is going to be better. You'll have, and I've put into that directional signage is better, certainly within a retail location. I know many older patients too, when they come to medical office buildings, they're absolutely overwhelmed. They can't find their way. In some cases, there's too much signage, and they can't find things. So. And a benefit too about being in a retail location is that there are amenities there that will benefit your patients. The patients will go there and they can go to get their medical appointment, they can get their groceries, they can hit the pharmacy.
Right.
And that's a benefit. Also, it's a benefit for staff because staff can quickly run out and get lunch.
Good point.
And sometimes that's difficult within a medical office building, which may have limited options. So
on a big campus.
So, there's pluses and minuses. And again, that's where I ask the practice, what's your goal? And that's what we're trying to achieve when we're working with these doctors. We're trying to make it so that their business is easier for them to reach their patients and for them and their staff to work efficiently. So what we are seeing in this market right now, which is great, is there is a lot of new construction going on, a lot of new medical office building product going on. Of course, we see a lot of hospital systems building new facilities, and not just building on campus, but off campus. We're seeing urgent care facilities being built. So we're seeing the way that a hospital looks is changing. We're seeing urgent care facilities. We're seeing standalone surgeries. So I think it's interesting to me how, medical real estate, the nature of it and the nature of hospital real estate is changing.
Absolutely. And it has. Some of it is changes over time with how healthcare is delivered. We're getting more patient-centric, I think, in the healthcare delivery system in general. But as I've been practicing healthcare law over the last 20 years, we had the 2008 recession where real estate, particularly here in Florida, went through some very hard times.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So my first 15 years or 10 years or so of practice, I would often, help a physician practice form. We'd form a practice LLC or a professional corporation, and then we'd form a separate one to own the real estate. And we still do that, but I don't see that as often as I used to, I think, because I think people are scared and might want to lease rather than buy in some ways.
I think so too. It gives them the flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, what we're seeing is that I think the whole nature of how physicians operate has changed. A lot of them are now becoming parts of hospital systems.
Right.
And for hospital systems, they're trying to reach their patients. And so they are leasing as well so that they can expand their reach to their patients.
Absolutely.
What we're seeing, I think, you've spoken sort of about the market cycles with real estate.
Uh-huh.
We're seeing a lot of Class A product coming on the market right now.
Brand new.
Class A means brand new.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing that, low vacancies. Rental rates are certainly going up, as are land and acquisition prices for buildings that are new. Older buildings, which could be, unfortunately, buildings that are 5-7 years old, they're Class B and C now. And they're not as competitive, and we're seeing dropping occupancy and lower rents, and they're becoming harder to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, just taking a look at buildings that are 5 years old and driving around and looking at the vacancy rates shows me how fast this market in Jacksonville is expanding.
Wow.
It's just, it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something, again, I think that doctors now, they have to be aware of, because you don't want to be obviously in a vacant space, because you're not going to be drawing your patients.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And rent or mortgage costs are one of the biggest expenses of any medical practice after payroll.
Sure.
So big decisions there.
Sure. And I think what doctors also have to understand too is most landlords, retail and commercial, don't understand the intricacies and some of the regulations and restrictions that doctors have to operate with.
Yes, let's dig into that.
Sure,
and I think
absolutely.
This is fascinating, because the leases that I have seen have changed so much since this retailization of healthcare has happened. Not only how we treat patients, but the way the market has changed, and the physician practices is in a strip mall next to a Publix or a Winn-Dixie nowadays, right?
Sure, absolutely. And that's been great, I think, for doctors, because we're seeing things like improved exposure for the doctors. I think that they have better signage, they have better street frontage, they've got better parking. They're seeing, the traffic counts and the foot traffic is much better for them. There's parking for patients, the staff, and doctors. And in certain cases in retail centers, doctors can even negotiate reserved parking spaces.
Covered parking.
Yes.
Yes.
And you just see in general, because of zoning, you'll see a higher parking ratio.
Interesting.
So, most retail has like a 5-to-1 parking ratio. That means 5 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. In general, with hospitals where they have their parking garages, you don't see that. So that's kind of the advantages of this retailization.
Okay.
You're going to be at key intersections with easy access, easy entrance, easy exit. You'll have traffic signals there to help with traffic flow. So I think that is a bonus.
But with the retailization of real estate and healthcare, we're seeing leases that look much different than they did 10 and 15 years ago, right? We have things like tenant improvement allowances, CAMs, administrative costs, holdover fees, things we didn't see.
Right.
Exclusivities. Let's talk
relocation rights. Absolutely.
Let's pull the veil back on some of those concepts. Sure. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think we can, talk about, we could talk about, I guess, let's just start at the beginning. Zoning. It's very important that the building is zoned, or the land is zoned properly.
So commercial is not good enough?
Commercial may not work. You have to look very carefully at the zoning code. And again, typical landlords will not be conscious of this.
Nor will typical brokers.
Correct.
Right?
Brokers will not. No. For example, in your practice, if you have blood drawing or imaging, you may be allowed to do this for your own patients, but the zoning may not allow you to do this for walk-ins. So it, depending on your business model, if the zoning is not right, it could severely hurt your practice. So that's something that you need to make sure your broker and your landlord knows up front.
Got it.
And they're not going to be aware of the sensitivities of that. And that's why, again, I do always ask the doctors that I work with, what is your medical model? What are you doing? Are you doing blood draws just for your patients, or
Mhm.
you're having walk-in traffic,
Mhm.
such as that? Because you want to make sure that the zoning is proper for your needs, because otherwise you may have to wait 180 days, for example, to change zoning. That will kill your practice. That will kill your business.
Mhm.
I think another thing that doctors are not going to be used to seeing is this idea of usable versus rentable square footage.
Yeah, explain that.
Sure. Usable square footage is what you see in an architectural plan, probably what you're used to seeing as the Exhibit A.
Exactly,
your
to the
leases.
lease. Yep.
It's the square footage of the space that you occupy. If you are especially if you're in a multi-tenant building, there is additional space that you don't occupy, but which you use. Things like the parking lot, the sidewalks that lead to your building, the lobby and entrances, the elevators, the mechanical shafts, the electrical closets, the data closets. That is common area space, but the landlord is going to make sure that you're going to be paying for a portion of that. So if you're a tenant, let's say you're one of 4 tenants, and you're 25% of the total space in an occupied building, you would be paying 25% of the operating expenses, which we often call common area maintenance, CAM costs.
CAM costs.
Right, and that's, again, that's a new term. You may see two numbers for rent. Originally, we used to have gross rents, which was basically you saw one number for your rent, and that covered all the expenses. That covered your rent and then also the operating expenses. We have started to move away from gross rent numbers. So that would just be one number, like $25 per square foot. That's what you're going to pay per year. The reason why, over time we have seen energy costs go up. So that's something that landlords don't want to take risk for. We have seen also buildings change over time. You have air conditioning. That's a cost. You have all the data and electrical costs that have gone in. We've got smart buildings now. They're wired. You've got computers. There's a high heat load.
Security
in addition to that,
systems.
security systems. So landlords have migrated away from being at risk for operating costs, and have migrated towards either a modified gross lease, where you see one number for your rent, and then if rent increases over that gross number, operating expenses are higher than that gross number, you'll be charged for that. You've seen that kind of rent number migrate towards a triple net lease, which is where you have a base rent, which let's call it $18 a square foot, plus your common area maintenance costs, your CAM costs, which will cover operating expenses, insurance, taxes, and you'll also be paying your utilities on your own as well. And again, that's shifting the risk for those kind of operating expenses more towards the tenant. Now, I know tenants often complain about CAM and operating expenses, but if you owned a building, you'd be paying those expenses anyway.
Right.
So it's sort of an expense you have to incur anyway. What I do caution tenants to do is be aware of what is in that those CAM expenses, because in many cases there are property management and administrative fees that are put in there, and you have the right to have your operating expenses audited every year. And that's kind of the fluff area where a landlord may pad expenses. So you want to actually ask very direct questions as to what is included in CAM. The other thing to be aware of is who is responsible for repairing what.
Yes.
And I think that we see two areas where tenants often feel that they are getting stuck with expenses that should be the landlord's expense. One of them is HVAC. The second one is a roof.
The roof.
The leaky roof. So no lease is going to be perfect. No lease is going to spell out every scenario in which the landlord picks up the cost versus the tenant. But in general, The landlord is responsible for the building envelope and the structure, and the
Right.
tenant is responsible for the space and interior, as well as their fair share of outside lighting and the parking lot, et cetera, et cetera.
Got it.
But in certain cases, landlords will require tenants to maintain the HVAC, which that's fair.
Maintain. So
Maintain.
I
But
might see a provision in a lease that will
Yes.
require the tenant to have a maintenance contract and to share a copy of that
Mhm.
contract. So the guy comes in every 6 months and changes the filters and adds the fluids and that kind of thing.
Exactly. Where we often have problems is when a unit, for example, the compressor needs to be
Yes.
replaced.
So thousands of dollars.
Thousands of dollars. And that's where a lot of the arguments come between landlords and tenants. And I think that's something that should be spelled out very clearly in the lease, because the landlord will tend to push that onto the tenant. Same thing with roof leaks. They'll push that on the tenant. Again, that's where you need to be smart, have a good attorney, and negotiate that as well. What I've seen too in retail leases is that tenants are responsible for storefront windows. And I would maintain, for example, that that's considered part of the building envelope in the structure and really shouldn't be a tenant expense. So there's just things that you need to watch for and be aware up front.
Right. Absolutely.
Of these types of expenses.
So the beauty of a lease negotiation is that we can define what is included in the common area maintenance. We can define what an administrative expense is. It might be a percentage, right?
It might be a percentage, and also I think you've got to be very careful as to what exactly is included. It should be for the property manager.
Yes.
It should be for the landscape workers. It should not include any kind of overhead or administrative expense from the developers or the landlord's home office.
Right.
That should be their own expense.
Should be site-specific expenses.
It should be site-specific.
So things like groundskeeping. Name some other things that's
I say
normal.
property manager's expense.
Okay.
And if the property manager has an on-site office, you just have to be careful to take a look at, for example, the telephone expense. Are they including telephone costs from the home office or not? Computer costs from the home office or not, security for, you just, I think taking a look and almost taking almost a forensic look at where those expenses are coming from is important.
And like you said, there's a right to audit those.
There's a right to audit those.
At least there's an expectation there should be.
Right, and if you don't see that right in your lease, I think that you need to negotiate that.
Absolutely.
And make sure that it's included there.
Absolutely.
Sure. What you're going to see, too, is tenant improvement allowances.
Let's talk about that a lot. Can we?
Absolutely.
So I'll often get a very excited entrepreneurial physician who's going out and leaving their practice and starting their own practice, and they're very excited about their brand new building. And by the way, the landlord is giving me tens of thousands of dollars in tenant improvement allowances, and they think it's free money.
It's not. And I think that people need to understand that you will see a higher rent number. And what the landlord is basically doing is they are financing your improvements to your space. Landlords will tend to deliver, if it's new space, they'll tend to deliver it to you, and I love these terms, cold gray shell, cold dark shell, vanilla shell. Always ask what that means, because everybody has a different definition. But basically they'll deliver you kind of, a roof, an open ceiling or not, and then walls that either have studs in them and are covered with drywall or not, and then a slab floor. They'll deliver that to you. You're responsible for putting in, you might be responsible for putting in runs for HVAC. You may be responsible for putting in additional lights, putting in the drywall, painting, putting any millwork that you need in your exam rooms. And in your procedure rooms, data closets, things like that. You're going to have to pay for that. Also for any kind of equipment that needs to be installed I usually think of that's heavy equipment, like an X-ray machine, for example, or an MRI. And actually, the landlord will not cover the cost of the equipment, but they need the TI allowance can be used to prepare the room for that type of equipment. And again, commercial landlords won't know, for example, that for X-rays you need to have a lead-lined room.
Right,
and
exactly.
you need to have a physicist come in and test it.
Right.
And then for MRIs, you're going to have a copper-lined room. They won't know that.
Right.
But that would typically come out of the TI allowance, but it's not going to cover the full expense. And also understand that when your lease terminates, that, all the improvements that you've made, they stay. They're
Right.
affixed to the building. So if you've got this beautiful chandelier that's been installed in your lobby, that stays.
Yeah.
Unless
the
it's negotiated.
definition of a fixture with a capital F. What is a fixture? So you could spend $50,000 on beautiful cabinets, and that stays with the real estate depending on how your lease is defining your fixtures, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you say that. I have seen, now I've seen a lot of medical practices migrate much more towards systems furniture and dirt walls so that they can actually take that with them.
Got it.
But that's where the landlord will not allow you to finance that. Because
Exactly.
they know that you can take
That's
it.
not a tenant improvement allowance.
That's not a tenant improvement allowance.
Yes.
So the other thing I think just, to be aware of is your lease term can be 3 to 5 years. You want that kind of flexibility there, but you also may want to negotiate renewals.
What's the norm? What's a normal term?
I would say three to 5 years. 3
Okay.
to 5 years. Now, and what I also say too is if the doctor would like to have a higher TI allowance and have the landlord finance improvements, you're going to see a longer term lease. So you may see a 10-year lease.
Okay.
And I think what I would advise doctors to do is ask for the lease with the tenant improvement allowance and without the tenant improvement allowance. Because in many cases, it may be cheaper for the doctors themselves to finance the tenant improvement allowance.
Absolutely.
Obviously, when you're borrowing other people's money, it's going to cost more. But that's the toss up between, do you have the liquidity and do you have the borrowing power to do that?
Absolutely. Let me ask a question there. Who manages the tenant improvements? So does a physician office who's getting a awful shell, whatever, the gray shell, who's hiring the contractor to come in and put in the cabinets? Who manages all of that?
That's a very good question. It can go either the landlord can do it for you as a build to suit, or in many cases, with the larger practices, they will actually do the fit out and they will hire their own architect and own contractors. But everything, all the plans and the contractors, everything has to be approved by the landlord.
Typically,
they want to make sure that you have an architect who can seal the drawings, an engineer who can seal the drawings. They want to make sure that the architect is licensed to basically be an architect, as well as have a contractor who is licensed. They want to see that permits are properly pulled, and then, of course, when you get your certificate of occupancy, they want to see that as well. And there will be inspections that the general contractor will be required to do by the municipalities. They want to make sure that all those inspections, the landlord wants to make sure those inspections are done properly.
And a lot of times that lands on the tenant, right? So
Correct.
Just because there's a tenant improvement allowance doesn't mean that the landlord is taking care of all of that, right?
No, and in many cases, the tenant improvement allowance is on a reimbursement basis, so that you have to incur the cost and then you get reimbursed.
So cash flow issues,
money
up
issues.
Front.
That's exactly right. And in many cases, it's a good idea to hire an owner's representative for that.
Absolutely.
Because you want to make sure that that every cost will be reimbursed, that you need to get reimbursed, and that something is installed properly. Because, for example, if you don't have an electrical inspector come out before you've put the final drywall on, and the electrical inspector can't see the wiring within the walls, they'll make you tear out the drywall. So you want to make sure that you have somebody who's representing you well. And honestly, physicians, their office managers, they don't have the time to do that.
I see that happen a lot. They think their office manager can just go take care of everything because they always just go take care of everything, right?
It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way.
It's a different ballgame.
It's tough. It definitely is tough.
We talked about lease terms being 3 to 5 years generally. A lot of clients think, like they have in their employment agreements or their independent contractor agreements, that there's an ability to get out early if they just give enough notice. But the fact of the matter is, I never see an early termination provision in a lease anymore. Is that your experience?
Yes.
It's like taking a loan.
You are taking a loan, and if the practice breaks up, if a doctor leaves the practice, if that doctor has signed on the original lease, they are responsible. It's the same issue for subleases. If you sublease a portion or all of your space, you may have it, and that has to also be approved in advance by the landlord.
Mm-hmm.
You, the original tenant, you are still responsible for the lease obligations for the entire terms.
That's something a lot of people are not aware of.
Right.
They think, okay, I found a subtenant, I'm free.
You're not.
But that's not the way the law works.
Yeah.
Now, you can negotiate that.
Certainly, you can. But in general, the landlord will not
Right.
allow you to do that. And again, understand that landlords, they're financing their buildings through banks. Banks want to see that security. They want to see that there is cash flow in the building, and they want to see that the tenants can't quickly kind of escape. So, they're protecting their asset as well. I think also landlords are not going to be aware of HIPAA requirements, and they're not going to be aware of sort of the stark and anti-kickback statutes at all. That is going to be foreign to them.
So let's talk about HIPAA. What are some HIPAA issues?
Well, I certainly, with patient privacy, I guess my understanding is when you've got consultation rooms, you have to have doors, you have to have locks. You also may have to have some sound attenuation in there so that people cannot easily hear what's going on.
Absolutely.
And that's something that's not normal for an
ice cream shop.
Ice cream shop or a typical office environment. Right. They're not going to be aware of that. So that is going to be important again for the doctor to inform the landlord that, especially if you're coming into second generation space, you may need the tenant approval allows just to make sure that you're meeting the HIPAA requirements.
Right. And then things about the right to inspection, so that the landlord can't just come in at any time, or because of OSHA type issues, we can't have improvements going on at all hours of the day. We can't have drywall dust in the lobby and that sort of thing.
And I think that you raise a very good point, because landlords try to, if they're doing improvements or any kind of repairs, they of course want to do it as cost effectively as possible. So they want it to be done during the day. You can't do that. You can't have a landlord doing it, where it would interfere with your patient flow, interfere with HIPAA requirements. So work, and that's something that I think should be put into a lease, that work that has to be performed, that would be sort of regular maintenance work, would have to be performed after hours or on weekends. Obviously, if there's an emergency, it would be performed immediately. But that's something I think that doctors need to be aware of, that needs to be negotiated. Because again, commercial landlords are not aware of it, and perhaps don't want to be aware of it.
Healthcare is different.
Healthcare is very different.
Particularly in real estate.
Absolutely.
Can we talk a little bit about the fair market value issue? When the landlord says, what do you mean this isn't fair market value? I can charge whatever rent I want to.
And typically, the landlord will charge what the market will bear and what the property will bear. To have, I guess per the Stark laws and anti-kickback statutes, fair market value analyses or broker opinion of values have to be performed, and these apply not only to the base rent but also to the operating costs and also to the renewal percentages. The escalation of rent clauses. So they will be absolutely surprised to be told what the rent should be. And broker opinion of values, or FMVs, are based on comparables, and you have to educate your landlord, and that's where your broker needs to also educate landlords that this is a requirement. And if you would like to have medical tenants, you must be aware that this is something that they have to comply with. There's no way around it. You cannot up your operating expenses, because that's also covered. So the rent has to be what is stated. It has to be at or below what the FMV states.
Very good.
The other point is that my understanding too is that you can't shop FMVs or broker opinion of values.
That's a tough one.
Because that's exactly what landlords will do.
Yes, they'll say, oh, well, my broker has this opinion that says this is the good rent. So yes, it gets questionable. It gets questionable.
But again, that's something that it can't be shopped. So again, that's an education process for these commercial landlords just to be aware of. I was going to say too, you may see within leases use restrictions if you're going into a retail center. A lot of times retail center will have a big box retailer, and they'll want to limit medical space. They may say, okay, we only will allow 3,000 square feet of space because they want to have parking.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that doctors need to be aware of. On the flip side, when a doctor is going into a retail space, they should negotiate exclusives with the landlord to make sure that they don't have their competitors going into the spaces. Landlords don't like to be limited as to the types of doctors they could have in their space. But what I have seen is I've seen clauses saying, you can't lease to another primary care doctor, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's defined.
Let's talk about that, yeah.
Or a clause I have seen is that a landlord cannot lease to another hospital group or competitor of the tenant. So
we can define
you can
who
define it,
the competitor would be,
Right.
whether that's XYZ company or
XYZ
any
health system.
Exactly. Or primary care could mean family, it could mean internal medicine, it could mean OBGYN, it could mean pediatrics. So that's where it's important to negotiate good terms in your lease and to have definitions.
Right. And I think certainly with primary care, commercial landlords and brokers don't know what that means.
I have no idea.
So you need to make sure that your definition of what a primary care is clearly spelled out. I certainly have run into situations where, a broker has brought another tenant into a center, and they've said, well, this is a pediatrician, you're a primary care, that's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Or this is an OBGYN, this is not a problem. Or this is a sports medicine doctor, it's not a problem. Those, in many cases, all those fall under from what I understand, the definition of primary care. So you have to be very careful, because again, commercial landlords and brokers won't know and or won't care. They want that maximum flexibility, but a good broker and certainly having a good attorney, you want to protect your doctor so that they have, they don't have competition. So.
Another thing that's interesting that we've spoken about before is that in the retailization of healthcare and of real estate, that you need to have your expectations right, because the strip mall might agree to an exclusive for your practice, but it could be just right across the street, a similar strip mall, and there's your competitor, and you don't have any control.
You have no control over that. So in many cases, what I often say is, exclusives are only as good as the paper they're written on, and then unless your landlord controls a huge tract of land, I don't know. It's something I think some cases, depending on the situation, maybe that's one thing that you can let go of. And I certainly have seen where, we've been very strong to negotiate an exclusive, and then a new development goes in across the street, and bang, if there isn't another primary care. But that's
Murphy's
life.
Law.
That's life. I also wanted to kind of go into too about lease commencement versus rent commencement.
Yes, please.
Lease commencement is when you actually, that's the date when you and the landlord sign the lease.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be when the rent actually starts. Sometimes the landlords will give you free rent periods,
mm-hmm.
which is great, as an inducement to come into the space. If space is new or requires fit out, there may be a time period when either the tenant or the landlord is given time to build out a space. That could be like a 60-day period or 120-day period,
mm-hmm.
Whatever is required by the scope of what the improvements are. If the tenant is performing the work, and even if the landlord is performing the work, you want to watch very carefully to make sure that that work is done and a certificate of occupancy is obtained, preferably before, but certainly on the rent commencement date.
Mm-hmm.
Landlords don't like go dark periods, and so if the tenant is doing the improvements and they don't get their CO in time, and even if they start paying rent on the rent commencement date, there could be additional penalties. Retailers don't like to have dark spaces, even if people are paying rent, because it gives the perception that there is a vacancy and then therefore there's a problem. So it's just something to be aware of, that there could be penalties for that.
And a lot of times that penalty might be that the lease goes away.
Correct.
Right? So
yes.
If you don't have your certificate of occupancy by the rent commencement date, then they could just pull it out from under you.
That's correct.
Right?
And then all your investments are gone, and your
Mhm.
careful planning and your credentialing, which actually gets me to another point.
Let's talk credentialing.
Landlords and most brokers don't understand the importance of an address and a suite number,
Absolutely.
and that it cannot change, and you must have it by the time you sign your lease.
Absolutely.
So you must
yeah.
ask for it, because credentialing can take 60 to 90 days, and it depends on the address and the suite number.
Absolutely.
And
Florida Medicaid is
Yep.
very tough about that. Medicare, it's a cash flow issue.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very, very difficult to become an in-network physician with the payers if they don't have your address. And you could maybe guess, but sometimes with the way these new properties are developed, right, there's not even an address yet.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the commercial landlords will say, well, gee, I'm not required necessarily to have it even for my building permit. That is something that you need. Well, a good broker should stay on top of the landlord. A good attorney will stay on top of the broker and the landlord to make sure that you get that information as soon as possible, because you don't want to run into this situation where you're paying rent on the space that you don't have all the proper credentialing and licensing for.
Absolutely.
So I think, another thing that I think we want to cover is I don't think we've talked yet about sort of corporate guarantees, personal guarantees, security deposits. Tenants are looked at as creditworthy by landlords and, of course, the banks that lend to them. So many commercial landlords will want a personal or a corporate guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're associated with a large hospital system, usually you can negotiate away the corporate guarantee, because in many cases the hospital system has better credit than the landlord. But I'd say with many private practices, a personal guarantee will be required.
So that means the individual physicians, usually all of the partners or owners of the group, will have to sign, just like if you're co-signing on a car loan for your kid's first car. The same kind of concept. So you're personally liable.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Now, I sort of have mixed feelings about this too, because I know that, there's Florida law allows a homestead exemption, and also most doctors have created corporations to protect their assets.
Right. Asset protection plans.
Exactly. But commercial landlords will ask for this, and it's something that you have to be aware of. Now, you may be able to negotiate a higher security deposit up front so that you don't have to sign a personal guarantee, because of course the personal guarantee appears on your financials, or you may be able to negotiate a personal guarantee which reduces during the term of the lease. But it's, again, everything is negotiable, and I think it's worth pushing back on. I feel in many cases that, if you've got a very strong medical group and a physician's practice, you don't need personal guarantee, because what are you really getting?
Right.
So again, I think you have to know, like these exclusivity clauses, for example, there are certain times when to push for things and when not.
Right, depending on the facts and
circumstances. And I think depending on the landlord, they may or may not be flexible, depending on even their financial position. So I always say everything's negotiable. Always go in there at 100% of what you feel you need to make your practice as successful as possible and have as few liabilities as possible.
Absolutely.
I think too, with rights, another thing that comes up is rights of assignment. An assumption. Be aware that if there's any changes in your practice, you may try to assign your practice to somebody else, because the partners may change, but the original partners who signed the lease are still going to be on the hook.
On the guarantees, yes.
That's right.
Absolutely. Yes. So in this era of mergers and consolidations in healthcare, sometimes the assignment provision, your ability to assign the contract to a successor organization that you merge into, might be the most important provision in the whole contract.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And again, everything is negotiable. If you are able to, prove that you have a very strong new team in there, the landlord may consent.
Absolutely.
Be aware too, you're going to show your financials.
That's always fun too.
Yeah.
And like I said, this is more like getting a loan than anything else.
Like getting
You're
a
on
loan.
the hook for a long time. There's no getting out of it. and you're going to have to show your financials.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you too, in the, up front when the broker is working with you and negotiating your lease, the landlord will ask to see your personal financials. Typically, it's 2 to 3 years of financials.
Mm-hmm.
So, certainly you can ask them to sign a confidentiality agreement
Very
or something
normal.
if you're exactly, and you should ask for that,
Mm-hmm.
but they will want that.
Got it.
So they'd like to see that as well. I think too, some things that you want to be aware of to give you flexibility is expansion rights.
Yeah.
So
so this is when you want bigger space.
Correct. You may want a right of first offer, right of first refusal in a certain space, especially if you feel that you're going to be a longer term tenant, given the market, given your patience and familiarity with your location. You want to negotiate that. That should not have any additional cost for that. But it's something you just want to maybe think about in terms of allowing your practice to flourish as best it can. One thing you should be aware of, though, is that landlords may have the right to relocate a tenant.
Very bad. Yes,
it is.
That's a tough one.
It
so
is.
Talk about that. So
Sure.
This is when you see where you're someplace you would go to, and this is very much a retailization situation, right? So
absolutely.
What happens usually is the neighbor needs to expand, and they exercise their expansion rights, maybe. And they want to move you over to the other corner of the strip mall.
Or they see, they can get a Fortune 500 tenant in, and they
have to have that space.
They need that space.
So
it's
they
going to
can kick you out.
That's exactly right. And they have that right to do so. Be aware that that's an issue. You can try to negotiate it out, but a lot of landlords like that flexibility. I think it's important for the practices to know is there are costs that you will incur that the landlord may not recognize. Credentialing, notice costs, relocation of your phone and data equipment, relocation of special equipment that needs recalibrating. They may not cover those types of costs.
Very good.
So you want to negotiate very specifically what costs can be reimbursed by the landlord for your inconvenience. They may just offer you like 1 or 2 months off of the rent. That may not be enough for you given the type of practice that you have.
Right. Another thing is notice of relocation. So if your suite number is going to change and you have to tell Medicare that you're going to be practicing in a different suite, and you have to do that 60 days in advance, you need the landlord to give you at least 60 days advance notice of the move, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another thing to be aware of is holdover rights.
Yes.
I think it's holdover means that after the termination or expiration of your lease, you do have the right to stay in your space. Holdover rights may or may not have a limit to that, but you will have to pay anywhere from 150% to 200% of your rent.
So your rent doubles if you stay after the lease term.
Correct.
There could be a provision in the contract that says that.
And you may want that as a backstop. Certainly if you want to be aware of your renewal deadlines. And typically those are 6 months before your lease terminates.
Yeah.
But let's say you miss them, or for whatever reason, how things can change. You may have a building that you're looking at and it falls through. You want to have the flexibility, so you want to have those holdover rights. Be aware that it's, the market rate tends to be 150 to 200%. But it's something that I think it's helpful to have in your lease because, again, it gives you flexibility. It allows continuity for your practice, and it helps. And most importantly, it helps with your patients. You just can't close down.
You can't.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We're very conscious that it really is about the patients. We've got to make sure that we provide the continued good care. Other things just to be aware about it. Landlord default and cure periods. When there are major repairs, you want to make sure, or emergencies, you want to make sure that the landlord responds accordingly. And you want to make sure that you have, cure periods clearly outlined, that they are, they cure within 10 business days, for example. Also, the landlords have the right to sell the property. And landlords may come to you and try to buy out your lease if they find like they have a whole new user. So, just be aware of that and, work accordingly.
Sounds good. Well, that's a lot about leasing.
Yeah, I think just, what I tell, my clients is, be aware of where growth is occurring. I always take a look at where roads are being built.
Mhm.
It definitely determines where houses are going to be built, where more retail centers are going to be built. We're seeing a lot of, for a lot of these new communities that are being built, we're seeing hospital systems and medical groups go there right up front and negotiating exclusive. So and they'll have exclusive for like 5 years.
Mhm.
So I think doctors and medical groups are becoming very savvy with targeting these new growing submarkets, even before all the road infrastructure is put in. So just, that's a good broker for you. We'll be on the lookout for markets that will be available for you. And if you tell them, this is the kind of patient base I have, I have a very large Medicare and Medicaid population, or my practice focuses on non-insurance patients, so they're upper income. They can help you target those submarkets early so that you can get in and either buy at a desirable price, or negotiate a good rental rate for you.
I like your theory about following the new roads.
Yes, it's amazing. And I can't believe in Jacksonville how much road work is being done, and you can see that it's absolutely influencing the growth patterns and the housing starts in this market. It's incredible.
And that's where the healthcare retail areas are going to be.
Oh yeah, and they're following it. I mean, I have to say that's one thing I've noticed, that the healthcare industry has become very savvy now about where they need to relocate, and they're becoming very proactive. So it's great. It's exciting.
So physicians have a lot of options,
and
they have great resources to make sure that they don't get into trouble in their real estate issues.
That's right. Yeah. So that they can focus on the most important thing, which is their patients.
Fantastic. Alex, thank you so much for this. This was so helpful.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I always learn something from you. So thank you so much.
This was great. Listeners, if you need to contact either of us, the screen shows how to contact us. Don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you very much for listening. Have a good day.
Thank you.